This video begins January 2006, on which Putin signs the NGO law. And the interesting thing about this is it was quietly signed, no public announcements, and it only leaks out 7 days after he signed it. This is, again, part of his effort to get control over the civil society. It expands the government's supervisory role in NGOs, and it gives the government the possibility of denying an NGO the right to be registered. And then if it's not a registered NGO, it's an illegal activity, it can be raided, the leaders arrested, etc., the organization destroyed. Part of the increasing authoritarianism of the Putin regime. In March of 2006, there was a presidential election in the Chechen Republic, and the son of the former leader, Kadyrov, who was killed by the bomb. You remember he went to a soccer match celebrating the Russian victory in World War II. And remember, the Chechen people in World War II were forced into exile, loaded up on freight trains and moved into Central Asia because Stalin felt that they could be a threat, that they would be sympathetic to the Germans as they advanced. So in March of 2006, new president, the son of the former one, a man named Ramzan Kadyrov. I'll spell it Ramzan. That's his first name, relatively simple. And the last name again is Kadyrov, Kadyyrov. Russian is a very phonetic language once you think about that. And Kadyrov continues this process of Chechenization. Putin is largely giving him a carte blanche. He's open. He could do whatever he wants within that region as long as he remains loyal to the central government. And so Kadyrov is still fighting against Islamic fundamentalists who refuse to be a part of the Russian Federation, and they're opposed to Putin and to Kadyrov and Kadyrov's government. So that's still a simmering struggle, but he's been much more successful at quelching the rebellion than the Russian army ever was. In May of 2006, we see that the head of the Federal Customs Service is fired for corruption, and as a result of that, there's a number of other security officials that are charged with corruption. They are fired. In July of 2006, we have the president firing one of the governors. Now, it's the second time he's done this, but this fella, Voronov, is kind of interesting, I think, because his region is the diamond-rich region of Russia. And he was arrested and charged with embezzlement because he was the CEO of the mining company as well as the governor of the region. And the firing was probably politically motivated, and Barinov is replaced by a former KGB official. And as I said earlier, this was the second time that Putin had fired a governor. In July, Shamil Basayev is killed. And this is important because he has been the undisputed leader of the radical wing of the Chechen insurgency. Shamil Basayev was responsible for the 2002 theater siege in Moscow and the 2004 Beslan school siege. And so his death is a big plus for the Russian military as well as the Kadyrov government in Chechnya. In October, a great Democrat, wonderful reporter, is murdered a day before Putin's birthday. Anna Politkovskaya. She was an award-winning Russian journalist. She had reported on the human rights abuse in the war against the Chechens. She was known for her criticism of the Putin regime. Her first book was called Putin's Russia, Life in a Fading Democracy, published in 2004. She was very critical of the Chechen president, Ahmed Kadyrov, and of his son Ramzan Kadyrov, who's the current president of the Chechen Republic. She was asked by the siege takers in Beslan to come and be a mediator. Oh no, I'm sorry. She was asked by the people in Moscow in the O2 siege. She was asked also by the hostage takers at Beslan, and she got on a plane in Moscow to fly to Beslan, and apparently she was drugged on the plane because she fell asleep, and when she landed, she was still asleep, and she never made it to the Beslan school site. We think that she was drugged by the Russian government, the security services, to keep her away. In November of this year, Alexander Litvinenko is poisoned, and he dies. He is a former KGB and FSB officer. In November of 1999, he and several other FSB officers accused their superiors of ordering the assassination of Boris Berezovsky. Now, 98 is still in the Yeltsin years, remember. And Boris Berezovsky was an ally of Boris Yeltsin. But this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Certainly it would have been later after Berezovsky breaks with Putin. However, Litvinenko and these other officers were arrested and charged with treason. He is acquitted, and he escapes the country, flees to Moscow. Flees to London. He escapes Moscow and flees to London. And while in London, he writes 2 books. And the first book is one that accuses the Russian security services of staging the September 99 apartment bombings as part of a plot to get Vladimir Putin elected president in 2000. He worked with Alexander Litvinenko, worked then in London with Boris Berezovsky, who was a major critic in exile of the regime. And on November 1st of 06, he is poisoned by polonium-210, and he dies a couple weeks later, November 23rd. The British government investigated and accused a man named Andrei Lugovoy, who was a former KGB officer, of bringing this very highly toxic, very radioactive polonium-210 in and pouring it into a cup of tea that Litvinenko drank, because when Lugovoy arrived in Moscow, he contacted Litvinenko, said he wanted to talk. They went out to a restaurant, and after that, Litvinenko started to feel terrible and went into the hospital. And the British doctors had trouble figuring out what the problem was. When they did, it was really too late. This was highly toxic, and as I said, he died a couple of weeks after he was poisoned. December 20th. 2006, Putin celebrates the, quote, glorious history of the spy service, and he does this before a meeting of former intelligence officers. Putin has always been proud of his service in the KGB, because KGB, in his estimation, was the principal shield, and that's one of the symbols for the KGB, of the Russian government, even though it was during the Soviet period. Because here is, again, Putin, the statist, who wants to keep the state strong and celebrates those that help to make the state strong. The British government, as I said before about Litvinenko, investigated, accused Lugovoy, and also accused the Russian government of complicity in this poisoning because this polonium is very, very difficult to get a hold of. It's very radioactive, and only the Russian government would have access to that. And so somebody in the government had to ensure that Lugovoy could get the radioactive material and smuggle it into England. And the British intelligence service were able to trace Lugovoy's path across Europe because he stopped in Germany, and they could trace his path because wherever he stopped, there was high radioactivity that is associated with polonium-210. All right, let's move on to 2007 now. The year begins, as the page shows you, with oil supplies cut to Belarus. Again, this is one of the old Soviet republics. Um, Under really dictatorial control, even though it has democratic structures. Um, but the problem with Belarus and Ukraine is that these countries that are now independent um, have gotten used to the fact that the oil that they receive from Russia has been subsidized going back to the Soviet era. So they're getting their oil far below market value. And both Belarus and Ukraine have been accused of siphoning off portions of that oil as it's going through their country, moving towards the West. And the new post-Soviet government wants to bring the price of oil that they're selling to their former allies more in line with world market, and this is a source of contention between Belarus and Russia, between Ukraine and Russia. In February of 2007, an important date because this is the day on which Putin, in Munich, Germany, attacks the United States in a major address at the Conference on Security Policy. This is an annual conference that invites foreign ministers, prime ministers, defense ministers, top politicians from Europe to meet and discuss issues of security. And Russia is, of course, invited, even though it is not a member of NATO, but it is invited, as are all the European or Eurasian countries. And in this speech, Putin attacks the United States for seeking to establish a unipolar world. He says the United States has overstepped its borders in all spheres, economic, political, humanitarian. He says the United States wants to impose its way on other states. He says the United States has gone from conflict to conflict without achieving solutions. It is a disruptive force in the world. Putin says he's tired of being lectured, being taught about democracy. So it's a pretty devastating critique of the Western position. He does take questions. He does defend his political reforms, but someone asked him a question about human rights in Russia, and he just brushed it off, did not answer it. Now, what you have to remember here, this is February 2007, is a little bit of the international context. You remember back after 9/11, Putin thought that he and Bush could form this alliance against Islamic terrorism. And that began to fray when the United States invaded Iraq to bring down Saddam Hussein in 2003, because the Russians were opposed to any state going in to change the leadership, to change the regime. This notion of regime change is very opposed by Putin, and hence the Russian support today for Syria. Also, have to remember that President George W. Bush's second inauguration, January 20th, 1905, his speech is largely remembered for what is called the Freedom Agenda. Bush, in this speech, talks about the United States' responsibility to help promote freedom around the world. And this is going to rub up against Russia because the way Putin defines freedom is not the same way that those of us in the United States define freedom. So, as he said in his speech in February, he's tired of being taught about democracy. All right, we come back then to March of 2007. And again, anti-Putin rallies of thousands are taking place, principally in St. Petersburg and Moscow, several other smaller cities. Police break up these rallies, arrest many, and this is all building up to the focus is the December parliamentary elections that are coming up. These demonstrations in March are often called the Dissenters' March, because this, particularly a new group that is formed called Other Russia, which is a kind of strange coalition of people who want to change the regime, but you have people from all different ends of the political spectrum. You have Garry Kasparov, former world champion, the chess player, who wants Russia to become a Western-style democratic government. Also working with the National Bolshevik Party, a new party that has been created a few years ago in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union. And these are extreme communists that want to follow Lenin's ideas. And so can you imagine liberal Democrats and these communists, national Bolsheviks, working together? So this coalition covers a lot of spectrum. The only thing that unites them is their opposition to Putin. But their numbers are small. I mean, we're talking thousands of people coming out demonstrating in cities that are, I think Moscow has 8 or 9 million people in the city. So you might get a few thousand coming out and demonstrating. And they tend to be obviously urban dwellers and among the better educated, the so-called intelligentsia of the past of Russia. Also in March, Putin announces that he's turning down an offer by the head of the Federation Council to amend the 93 Constitution to permit him to run for the presidency in 2008. But some of you may already know what happens in 2008 and get an inkling of this, where Putin, because of his legal background perhaps, wants to maintain at least the letter of the Constitution, if not the spirit of the Constitution. In April 2007, Boris Berezovsky publicly comes out calling for the overthrow of Putin. Now, and remember, he's in exile in London, where he was granted asylum in 2003. Also, in April, Boris Yeltsin dies, and Putin leads the tributes at Boris Yeltsin's funeral. Boris Yeltsin died on the 23rd of April of heart failure. Putin declares a national day of mourning on the 25th of April, when Yeltsin is buried. All entertainment programs are suspended for that day. And in his little address at the gravesite, Putin says that we should thank Boris Yeltsin because a new democratic Russia was born during his time. He says the people, the new state of Russia, the Russian Federation, is a state that belongs to the people. And that Boris Yeltsin gave Russia a new constitution, which gives human rights as a supreme value. Beautiful words, not really carried out by his regime. The funeral of Boris Yeltsin was the first Russian Orthodox state funeral since 1894. And if you remember, 1894 is the year of the assassination of Alexander III. There could be no state funeral for the fan for Nicholas II, because he had resigned as Tsar when he was assassinated by the Bolsheviks. All right, so let me end this with the Duma elections, and then we'll talk about Time magazine selecting Putin as the Man of the Year in 2007. So, the Duma elections, very interesting results, and you have the chart. Um, you see the strong support for United Russia. This overwhelming victory of United Russia creates the most conducive conditions for Vladimir Putin to handle his presidential succession problem that's coming up in 2008. By keeping the State Duma under the control of United Russia, you now really have, for the first time in post-Soviet Russia, a party of power. And it enables the president to nominate his close ally, Dmitry Medvedev, to run for the presidency in 2008. The 2007 Duma elections, the first national election without single member districts. Sometimes you'll see that in the text, SMD, where they had the constituencies in the past. Now, when you hold the national elections, it is exclusively you vote for a party, and that party, depending upon the number of votes it gets, if it gets above the threshold, selects their party members to be in the Duma. The 11 parties that competed on the ballot, only 4 had seats from in the new Duma. And you have the chart there. You can take a look at that. In terms of the fairness of this election, international observers kind of gave it mixed reviews. There was, because the state has been pressuring the media, has gotten rid of Berezovsky and Guzinski, who built their own media empires. Now they are controlled by the state. They're still private media, but very much under the thumb of the state. So much so that there was hardly any coverage of any other candidate except those that ran under United Russia throughout the country. And you remember one of the reforms that Putin pushed in supposedly is after the Beslan crisis, the threshold was raised from 5% to 7%. That's going to force the fewer parties to be really represented into the Duma. All right. So after the December 07 elections, United Russia is got an absolute majority, super majority in the Duma, and Putin can get anything through the Duma that he wants. The Time Man of the Year is an interesting selection here, because Putin is in his last year as president, and it's probably been his most successful year. In fact, the article in Time magazine about the selection of Man of the Year, the title was Choosing Order Before Freedom. Choosing order before freedom. And that really does talk about the politics under Putin in Russia. Order is important to the Russian people. That comes through in every public opinion poll. They want stability, and Putin has been trying to provide that at the cost of democratic rights and freedoms. Now, Time had to address the issue of his selection because they said that selection of a person, Man of the Year, sometimes a Person of the Year, was not really an honor, but it was a clear-eyed recognition of the person's role in the world, and a clear-eyed recognition of the world as it is. And Times their selection is ultimately about leadership. And Putin had the extraordinary feat of imposing his leadership and stability on a nation that has rarely known such stability, and that he has brought Russia back to the table as a world power. Hence their selection of him in 2007. So let me move on and try to finish 2008 before I cut this off. 2008, there's a presidential election, um, and you have the results on the chart that shows Medvedev winning by 71%. Zhuganov again ran for the communists. Zhirinovsky ran again as from the Liberal Democrats. And this Democratic Party of Russia, Yabloko, as it's not popularly known, ran and got 1% of the vote. Clearly, it's an overwhelming endorsement of Putin's policies in United Russia. On May 7th, Medvedev takes the oath, and the next day, he appoints Putin as his prime minister. And Putin talks about the fact that they discussed this issue and that Medvedev will continue the policies and that Putin will now be in charge of the formal government position as prime minister. 2008, in August, we have the war with Georgia. And you know that Georgia has become the collapse of the Soviet Union, an independent country. But there are two parts of the Georgian Republic, Ossetia and northern Abkhazia, that want to be affiliated with the Russian Federation. A lot of Russians have moved there. Um, I'm not sure if it's the Russians are more than 50% of the population, but they are a substantial part of that population. And they don't want to be part of Georgia. They want to be part of the Russian Federation. And Russia has encouraged them. Russia has supplied arms to the militias within these two northern regions of Georgia. And there's been tension between them. The Georgian army has tried to recapture these areas. And so in August, um, the Georgian army, with this president who thinks he's now going to unite the country, really fires upon these two regions. There are Russian peacekeepers in the region. The Russians sent them there to keep the peace. They had no Georgian approval. But then they return the fire, and hence you have a war with a 5-day war with Russia sending its troops in to Georgia. And the United Nations and European leaders get involved, negotiate a ceasefire, and the Russians withdraw their troops, but they really taught the Georgian president a lesson that he cannot act with impunity. In September of 2008, some of you may remember this, the world financial crisis that starts in the United States with the bundling of mortgages and providing mortgages to people who could not really afford to buy houses, etc. The big banks, the Lehman Brothers and other banks collapsing. This hits Russia. This is a tremendous impact upon the oligarchs. Their funds, like many wealthy people, are cut substantially. Russia is better able to withdraw the 2008 financial crisis than the one that occurred in 98, 10 years earlier, because of the economic policies that the Putin regime has put in place. The building up of what we in the West often call rainy day funds, funds that can be used in the case of an emergency to kind of stabilize the economy. And then the Russian regime, while it creates problems, the value of the ruble drops, but it's not a complete free fall as it was in '98. But it is a serious blow to the oligarchs, which helps in a bizarre way the Putin administration to reinforce its position of control over the oligarchs. In November, that constitutional change was proposed to allow for the next presidential election to change the term of office from 4 years to 6 years. and that is approved. And then there's also debate raging about the Russian desire to deploy intermediate range ballistic missiles that have been banned by prior international agreement between the United States and the Soviet Union. And so tensions between the United States and uh, Russia, Russian Federation, in 2008 are ratcheting up again. All right, now at this point, I'm going to take a break, and the next video will begin the Medvedev years as president, and we'll talk about the relationship between Medvedev and his prime minister, Vladimir Putin. All right, we'll be seeing you again soon.